Rebecca Sterling pointed her finger directly at Daniel Mercer's chest, in front of 14 executives, in front of every person who had ever watched this man hold this company together, and she said it loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "You are nothing without this job." Daniel didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He reached up, unclipped his badge, and placed it on the table. Then he stood up and walked out. No goodbye. No threat. No last word. Just a man who had finally heard enough, and a room full of people who suddenly realized they had no idea what they were about to lose. What Rebecca Sterling didn't know was that within 48 hours, the man she just humiliated would be sitting across the breakfast table from her biggest competitor and accepting a title she had refused to give him for 7 years. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because what happens next will change the way you think about who actually holds the power in any room. The storm hit Denver before the sun fully rose. It wasn't the kind of storm that makes people poetic. It was the kind that breaks tree branches and floods underpasses and reminds you that nature has no interest in your schedule. Rain came sideways against the glass towers downtown, and somewhere inside the Apex Grid Technologies headquarters, 14 floors up, behind a wall of spotless windows, 14 senior executives were already in their chairs, coffee cooling folders open, waiting. Daniel Mercer arrived at 7:52 a.m. He always arrived early. Not because anyone required it. Not because he was performing ambition for the benefit of the people watching. He arrived early because he had a 10-year-old daughter at home who needed breakfast and a packed lunch, and a father who didn't leave the house looking like he was running from something. So he rose at 5, made Sophie's sandwich, checked the weather, drove her to school by 7:15, and still managed to beat most of the executive team to the office. He set his laptop bag on the conference table, the long glass one on the 14th floor, that Rebecca Sterling had paid an interior designer $16,000 to select, and he opened his computer without ceremony. No small talk, no glad-handing. Just a man who came to do the thing he came to do. The other executives filed in around him. Miles Harrington, the vice president of corporate strategy, took the seat 3 chairs to Daniel's left and gave him a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Claire Donovan, general counsel, settled in across the table with a yellow legal pad. 2 regional directors, 4 department heads, a pair of financial analysts who looked young enough to still be impressed by glass walls and expensive furniture. And then Rebecca Sterling entered. She wore the kind of charcoal blazer that cost $1,200 and looks like it costs nothing. Her hair was perfect. Her posture was the posture of someone who had decided somewhere around age 40 that she would never again walk into a room looking uncertain. She was 44 years old, and she had been Apex Grid's CEO for 11 months, and in those 11 months, she had reorganized 3 departments, terminated 2 legacy contracts, fired 6 people, and made the company's quarterly numbers look extraordinary, at least on paper. She sat at the head of the table. She didn't greet anyone. She looked directly at Daniel. "Let's hear it," she said. Daniel had been preparing this presentation for 11 days. Not because he was slow, because he was careful. He had run the simulations 43 times. He had cross-referenced his findings with 3 external engineers. He trusted engineers. He'd built relationships with over 7 years of actually answering the phone when things went wrong at midnight. He had documented every data point. He had written a 17-page technical summary that even a non-engineer could follow if they were willing to read it honestly. The problem was simple, in the way that structural cracks are simple. You could see it clearly. What made it terrifying was the consequence of ignoring it. Project Sentinel was Apex Grid's crown jewel, a $620 million emergency energy management system contracted to serve dozens of hospitals, airports, and critical commercial facilities across several western states. 7 years in development. The kind of contract that gets a CEO photographed shaking hands with governors. Sentinel worked perfectly under normal conditions. That was the problem. Emergency infrastructure isn't tested by normal conditions. It's tested the moment everything else fails. And Daniel had discovered during a simulation that no one else had run, because no one else had thought to run it, that during a major regional power disruption, Sentinel software contained a synchronization defect that would cause multiple facilities to simultaneously draw on the same backup distribution nodes. In plain language, the system designed to prevent a blackout could under the exact conditions it was built for cause 1. Not definitely, not always. But the probability window was real, and the facilities it would affect were hospitals. Daniel needed 96 hours. 4 days of additional testing to isolate the defect, patch the routing protocol, and verify the fix. Rebecca had already promised investors that Sentinel would launch Monday. Today was Thursday. Daniel stood at the end of the table and began speaking. He kept his voice level. He used clear language. He showed his data. He explained the defect, its trigger conditions, its potential impact, and the specific testing window he was requesting. He did not catastrophize. He did not perform alarm. He simply told the truth, the way he had always told the truth, which was plainly and without decoration. When he finished, the room was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Rebecca spoke. "Daniel." Her voice had a particular quality when she was about to be condescending, a kind of performative patience. The tone of someone who has already decided the answer, but is willing to let you finish your sentence. "We've all reviewed the risk matrix from last week. The board has reviewed it. Our technical partners have reviewed it." "They reviewed last week's matrix," Daniel said. "This data is newer." "The launch is Monday," Rebecca said. "That's not changing." "Rebecca, the contracts are signed." Her voice sharpened. "The investor calls are scheduled. The logistics teams in 5 states have been coordinating for months. You're asking me to call every one of those stakeholders and explain that we need 4 more days because of a simulation. A simulation that shows a failure probability high enough to—" "Daniel." She said his name like a period. "You've been here 7 years." The room shifted slightly. Something in the air changed. The 2 young analysts looked down at their folders. Miles Harrington's expression went carefully neutral. 7 years, Rebecca repeated. Apex Grid gave you stability when you needed it most. A consistent salary, benefits, a team, a title. She paused. You have a daughter to think about. Daniel went still. He didn't respond immediately. He had learned over decades of dealing with difficult situations in high-pressure environments that the most important thing you could do in a room full of people was control the speed at which you reacted. Let the other person believe they'd landed somewhere important, then find out if they had. Rebecca, he said quietly, this isn't about my personal circumstances. I'm saying that this company has invested in you, she said, and I need to know that investment is mutual. The investment is 7 years of work, Daniel said. What you're looking at right now is part of that work. What I'm looking at, Rebecca said, is a director who is asking me to embarrass this company in front of investors, partners, and the board because of a simulation run by one person. I've had 3 independent engineers. Who answers to you, she said. Daniel looked at her. You could pull any engineer in this building and have them run the same simulation right now. The result will be the same. Monday, Rebecca said. That's the answer. Daniel breathed in slowly through his nose. He looked around the table. At Miles, who was studying his pen. At Claire, who was watching Daniel with an expression that was carefully professional, but not entirely without sympathy. At the department heads, who had one by one found interesting things to look at on the table in front of them. He turned back to Rebecca. If Sentinel deploys Monday, he said, and a major regional disruption triggers the synchronization failure, the facilities that lose backup power will be hospitals. Not offices, not data centers. Hospitals, ICUs, operating rooms. The system built to protect them will be the mechanism of the failure. Rebecca put her palms flat on the table. Daniel. Her voice changed. It dropped half a register, went somewhere colder. You built your entire life around the security this company gives you. The room went completely still. Something moved behind Daniel's eyes. Something old and quiet. Rebecca, Claire said very softly. Rebecca didn't look at Claire. She was looking at Daniel, and she pushed harder. You're nothing without this job. 14 people in that room. 14 people who heard exactly what was said and exactly how it was said, and who understood immediately that the line separating professional criticism from personal assault had just been crossed so completely that it almost didn't seem real. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel sat with his hands folded on the table. He looked at Rebecca Sterling, and the look on his face was not anger. It was not humiliation. It was something much quieter and much more dangerous. It was recognition. He finally saw her clearly. "Is that really how you see me?" he said. Rebecca's jaw tightened. She had expected surrender. She had expected the sight of a single father calculating his mortgage payment and making the logical financial decision to fold. She had seen it before. Pressure the right person in the right way, and ambition wins. "I'm reminding you," she said. "Who gave you the opportunity?" Daniel looked down at the table. For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows, 14 floors above a flooded Denver street. Then he opened his laptop. He pulled out the Apex Grid badge clipped to his jacket. He set it on the table. Slowly, deliberately, without drama. He closed his laptop. He stood up. "Then the opportunity is yours again," he said. Rebecca stared at him. "I resign," Daniel said. No volume, no heat, no shaking hands or red face or stumbling exit. Just those two words delivered with the same evenness he brought to everything. The same steadiness that had made him irreplaceable for 7 years without anyone understanding why. He picked up his laptop bag. "Daniel," someone said. He didn't look to find out who. He walked to the door. He opened it. He walked through it. Rebecca sat at the head of the table for 4 seconds after the door closed. Then she looked around the room. "He'll call HR before dinner," she said. Miles nodded once, just enough to show he agreed, just carefully enough not to commit to anything. Claire Donovan said nothing. She looked at the badge on the table. Then she looked at the closed door. Then she opened her legal pad and wrote something at the top of a fresh page. The rain had let up slightly by the time Daniel reached the parking garage. He sat in his older Ford for 3 minutes before starting the engine. Not crying, not shaking, just sitting with the reality of what had just happened, letting it settle, letting it become real, the way major decisions need a quiet moment to become real. He had 7 years in that building. I had 7 years of 6 a.m. mornings and midnight phone calls and patient explanations and careful documentation and problems solved before they became disasters. He had 7 years of being the man who answered when everyone else was unavailable. And the person running the company had just told him in front of 14 witnesses that without the paycheck she signed, he was nothing. He started the car. He had to pick Sophie up at 3:15. In the executive suite. Rebecca moved quickly. She called Miles into her office within 20 minutes of Daniel's exit. "I need you to step into his role," she said. "Temporarily, just until we find someone." Miles nodded. He didn't show what he was feeling, which was something complicated that lived in the space between relief and anticipation. "I can do that," Miles said. "Sentinel launches Monday," Rebecca said. "That doesn't change." "Understood. I need you in Daniel's office this afternoon. Review everything. Get me a status by 5. Miles left her office with his head already full of plans. What Miles found in Daniel's office was not what he expected. He had expected somewhere in the back of his mind that Daniel might have left things messy. Deleted files. Missing passwords. The quiet sabotage of a man with a grievance. There was nothing like that. Daniel's documentation was immaculate. Every project file was organized, named and indexed with the kind of system that someone builds when they plan to hand it off cleanly and never need to explain it. Every client contact had notes. Real notes, not just names and numbers, but context history. The particular way a hospital's facilities manager preferred to receive technical updates. The 3 vendors who needed 48 hours notice instead of 24. The utility operator in Arizona who had a hard stop every day at noon because of a family situation Daniel had respected without being asked. It was all there. The problem was that documentation cannot think. Miles could read what Daniel had done. He couldn't understand why Daniel had made specific choices at specific moments, because that knowledge lived in Daniel's judgment, and judgment isn't a file you can open. Miles spent 4 hours in that office. When he emerged, he told Rebecca everything looked manageable. He didn't tell her what he was actually feeling, which was a particular kind of vertigo. The vertigo of a man who has spent months successfully repackaging another person's work, and has just discovered for the first time exactly how much of that work he never actually understood. The first client call came at 4:20 p.m. It was Riverside Health Network, one of Apex Grid's largest hospital clients, and one of Sentinel's primary contracted facilities. The call wasn't about Sentinel's launch. The caller, the network's director of facilities infrastructure, a man named Gary Whitfield, who had been working with Daniel Mercer for 4 years, asked a single question: "Where is Daniel?" The receptionist transferred the call to Miles. Miles explained that Daniel was no longer with Apex Grid, and that he, as VP of Corporate Strategy, was now overseeing the Sentinel rollout. Gary Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need to request an independent technical review before our facilities sign off on the Monday launch." Miles kept his voice smooth. "Of course. We can schedule—" "I need it before Friday," Gary said. Miles told him they'd make it work. He hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then his phone rang again. Different client. Same question. "Where is Daniel?" By the time Daniel got home, he had 3 missed calls from Apex Grid's HR department and 1 from Miles Harrington's personal cell. He didn't return any of them. He set his phone on the kitchen counter and started water for pasta. Sophie came home at 4, dropped her backpack in the hallway, and walked into the kitchen. She was 10 years old and observant in the way that children who've been raised by someone quiet tend to be observant. She noticed things, and she processed them, and when something seemed wrong, she came at it directly. She looked at her father. She looked at the kitchen, which was unusually clean for a Thursday, because he'd clearly been home longer than usual. "Did you get fired?" she said. Daniel almost smiled. "No," he said. "I finally decided where I shouldn't work anymore." Sophie climbed onto the bar stool at the kitchen island and put her elbows on the counter and looked at him. "Are we going to lose the house?" "No." "Promise." He turned to look at her directly. "I promise you we are going to be okay. I don't know exactly what okay looks like right now, but I know it's coming." Sophie considered this with the concentrated seriousness of someone who has learned that vague reassurances and real reassurances feel different. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Daniel said. "Then they're stupid," she said. "Possibly," he said. She got off the bar stool and went to the pantry to get a snack, apparently satisfied with this assessment. Daniel turned back to the stove. He stood there in his kitchen in the house he'd bought 3 years after his wife died in the city where he'd raised his daughter alone, and let the silence settle around him like something that had been waiting patiently. He had no plan for what came next. He had resigned without knowing what was on the other side. That was not recklessness. That was a calculation of a completely different kind. The calculation of a man who had finally decided that there was a line somewhere between financial responsibility and self-abandonment, and that the line had been crossed. He didn't know what was coming. He just knew that what he'd left wasn't sustainable, and that something real would have to replace it, because Sophie was watching, and she would learn from whatever he did next. The pasta water began to boil. Done. His phone rang at 6:47 p.m. Unknown number, Denver area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Daniel Mercer." "Yes." "Jonathan Vale." Daniel went still. I knew that name. Everyone in the energy infrastructure industry knew that name. Jonathan Vale had built North Star Energy Systems from a mid-size regional firm into Apex Grid's most dangerous national competitor over the course of 12 years. He was 51 years old, deeply private, and had a reputation in the industry for being willing to pay any price for someone whose judgment he trusted. "Mr. Vale," Daniel said. Jonathan Vale said. "You're not at Apex Grid anymore." It wasn't a question. "No," Daniel said. "I heard what happened." Daniel waited for the gossip. For the subtle angling to extract information about Sentinel, about Rebecca Sterling's contracts, about the clients. That was how these conversations usually went. Jonathan Vale said, "Are you under a non-compete?" Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a small realignment, like a compass needle finding north. "No," he said. A pause. "Good," Jonathan said. "Have breakfast with me tomorrow." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't really drinking. He thought about the badge on Rebecca Sterling's conference table. He thought about the rain. He thought about 7 years of 6 a.m. mornings. He thought about a man named Jonathan Vale, who in a 2-minute phone call had not asked him once what Apex Grid knew, what clients were unhappy, or what inside information he might be willing to share. He had only asked one question. "Are you under a non-compete?" Like a man whose only concern was whether Daniel was available. Like a man who already knew what he wanted. Daniel wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. They knew my name, he thought, before she ever did. He sat there for a long time in the quiet house, listening to the rain, ease off, listening to the city return to its normal sounds. Tomorrow, he would have breakfast with Jonathan Vale. Tonight, he would simply sit here. He had made one of the most frightening decisions of his life today. Frightening not because he doubted it, but because it was real and irreversible, and he had made it without a safety net, the way real decisions sometimes need to be made. And what surprised him sitting in that kitchen at 9:30 on a Thursday night was not that he was afraid. It was that mostly underneath all of it, past the uncertainty and the unknown and the practical weight of being a single father who had just walked away from his income, he was not afraid at all. He was simply ready. Back in Apex Grid's executive suite, the lights were still on. Rebecca Sterling sat at her desk with 4 open files, 2 cold cups of coffee, and a slowly tightening understanding that the afternoon had gone differently than expected. 3 client calls requesting technical reviews. 2 hospital group expansions placed on informal hold. A utility partner in Arizona who had requested a conversation with Daniel or his equivalent, a phrase that had landed on Rebecca's desk like a small, precise knife. She stared at her screen. He'll call HR before dinner. She had believed that. She had believed it because she believed she understood what Daniel needed. Stability, security, the income that kept his daughter in school and his mortgage paid, and she believed that need would override everything else. She pulled up his personnel file. 7 years of performance reviews, consistently rated in the top tier. 1 promotion 3 years ago. Compensation. That was, she noticed this for the first time, really noticed it, notably below what 3 of the senior directors above him earned, despite his performance history being stronger than all of them. She scrolled to the note Miles had written 6 months ago, recommending against Daniel's request for a promotion to VP level. Mercer is technically excellent, but lacks the executive presence and broader strategic vision required for VP-level responsibility. She had signed off on it. She remembered doing it. Miles had made a compelling argument, or at least an articulate one. She closed the file. She opened Sentinel's project history instead, pulling up the 18 months of documentation preceding today's crisis meeting. She started at the beginning. She read for a long time, and slowly, the way understanding sometimes arrives when it arrives too late. She began to see something in the document history that she had never looked at closely enough before. The names attached to the recommendations. The names attached to the solutions. The names attached to the decisions that had kept Sentinel's development on track through 3 separate near-crisis moments. One name appeared again and again in the technical substrata of every document. Not in the executive summary at the top, where the credit lived. In the actual work. Rebecca Sterling sat very still. Then she picked up her phone and called Miles. He answered on the second ring. "How are we looking?" he said. His voice was steady. "Pull up the Sentinel documentation from April of last year," Rebecca said. "The routing protocol revision." A brief pause. "Sure," Miles said. "What do you need?" "The original draft," she said. "I want to see who wrote it." Silence. "Miles," she said. "I'll let me find it," he said. Tonight, she said. She hung up. She sat with her hands on her desk in the quiet office. The storm had completely passed. The city outside was wet and dark and completely still. The glass towers around her reflected one another in long, broken lines of light across the wet streets below. She had told a man he was nothing. She had told him that in front of 14 people. She had believed with total certainty that his dependence on this company's paycheck was a lever she could pull. She was already beginning to understand that she had misidentified the lever entirely. The question, the one that would keep her awake until almost 3 in the morning, wasn't what Daniel would do next. The question was, what exactly was holding Apex Grid together? And whether the answer to that question had just walked out the door wearing a plain shirt, carrying an old laptop bag, and leaving his badge behind on a $16,000 table without a single backward glance. Across the city, in a house that didn't have expensive furniture, or a glass-walled office, or a stock portfolio. A man named Daniel Mercer washed the dinner dishes, checked that Sophie's lunch was packed for tomorrow, and went to bed. He slept without difficulty. That, too, was its own kind of answer. The badge sat in the middle of the conference table, like an accusation nobody wanted to touch. For a full 30 seconds after Daniel walked out, nobody in that room said a single word. 14 senior executives, people who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, who gave presentations to governors, who had opinions on everything, sat in complete silence and stared at a small plastic rectangle with Daniel Mercer's photo on it. Then, Rebecca Sterling straightened in her chair, smoothed the front of her blazer with both palms, and looked around the table with the particular expression of someone who has just done something they're not entirely sure about, but absolutely cannot show doubt in front of witnesses. "Well," she said, "that's unfortunate." Miles Harrington exhaled slowly through his nose. "Do you want me to go after him?" "No," Rebecca said immediately. "Let him go." Claire Donovan looked at the badge. Then she looked at the door. Then she opened her legal pad and wrote something at the top of a fresh page. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The way she wrote it deliberately, without rushing, told anyone paying attention that she was creating a record. Rebecca noticed. She didn't comment on it. "Miles," she said instead, "I need you in Daniel's office this afternoon. Full status review on Sentinel. Everything he was managing, every client contact, every vendor relationship. I want a complete picture by 5 o'clock." "I can do that," Miles said. "Sentinel launches Monday," Rebecca said, looking around the table, slowly making eye contact with each person in turn, the way she'd been coached to do in executive leadership seminars. "That does not change. What changes is that we now handle this without Daniel Mercer, which frankly is something this company should have been prepared to do anyway." She paused. "He was one person," she said. "We have hundreds." Nobody agreed out loud. Nobody disagreed out loud either. The department heads nodded in the careful, non-committal way of people who understand that the person at the head of the table has just made a statement that requires agreement but is not yet clearly true. Claire Donovan wrote something else on her legal pad. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Miles went straight to Daniel's office. What he found there would be the first real crack in everything. Rebecca believed about the morning's events, though he wouldn't tell her that. Not yet. Not completely. Daniel's office was immaculate. Not cleaned out immaculate. Daniel had taken his personal a framed photo of Sophie, a small coffee mug, a worn paperback that had lived on his desk for years, but everything else was exactly where it should be. Every project file organized, every folder labeled, every client record annotated with the kind of detailed human context that takes years to accumulate. The man had not sabotaged a single thing. He hadn't deleted a file. He hadn't changed a password. He hadn't taken a single document that belonged to Apex Grid. Miles sat at Daniel's desk and started going through the Sentinel files. An hour in, he stopped. He sat back in the chair. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, because he was beginning to understand something that he could not afford to understand fully. Not yet. Not while Rebecca was expecting a clean 5 o'clock report. The thing he was beginning to understand was the difference between knowing what someone did and knowing why they did it. Daniel's documentation told Miles everything about the what. The what was meticulous and comprehensive and organized so well it almost looked simple. But the why? The judgment behind the decisions. The relationships behind the client notes, the particular logic that connected a vendor's delay in Arizona to a routing adjustment in Colorado, to a conversation with a hospital administrator in Nevada that wasn't in any file. That lived in Daniel Mercer. And Daniel Mercer was somewhere on the other side of the city, probably making his daughter a snack. Miles's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Rebecca. He sent it to voicemail. He needed 5 more minutes to decide what version of the truth he was going to deliver at 5 o'clock. The first client call came at 4:20 p.m. Miles was still at Daniel's desk when the call transferred to him. Riverside Health Network. Director of Facilities Infrastructure. A man named Gary Whitfield, who had Daniel's personal cell number saved under the label D-Call Anytime. I heard Daniel's no longer with Apex Grid, Gary said. His voice had the flat, careful quality of someone choosing their words deliberately. That's correct, Miles said. I'm stepping in as interim lead on Sentinel. Miles Harrington, VP of Corporate Strategy. I want to assure you that the transition... I'm going to need to request an independent technical review, Gary said, before my facilities sign off on Monday's launch. Miles paused for exactly 1 beat. Of course, we can absolutely schedule before Friday, Gary said. We'll make that work, Miles said. Gary Whitfield said thank you and hung up without another word. Miles sat with the phone in his hand. Then it rang again. Different client. Same question asked 3 different ways, arriving at the same place. Where is Daniel, who's handling technical certification? We need to speak with someone who can answer questions about the synchronization protocols. Synchronization protocols. The exact phrase from Daniel's presentation that morning. The presentation Rebecca had dismissed. By the time Miles walked into Rebecca's office at 5:15, he had fielded 7 client contacts, each one a variation of the same conversation, and he had spent the last 20 minutes in the hallway deciding how to present this information in a way that was accurate but didn't make the morning's events look as catastrophic as they were beginning to feel. He sat down across from Rebecca. How are we looking? She asked. Manageable, Miles said. There are some client concerns which is expected after a personnel change. I've handled them. Rebecca studied him. What kind of concerns? Requests for technical reassurance. Standard transition anxiety. I'll have it contained by tomorrow. Rebecca held his gaze for a moment. 7 calls, she said. Miles didn't react. Claire told me, Rebecca said. 7 client contacts in 4 hours, all asking about Daniel. It's a transition. Miles. Her voice was the voice she used when she wanted someone to stop performing and start being honest. What are they actually asking? Miles was quiet for a moment. They're asking whether the launch is safe without him signing off on it, he said. The office went very still. Rebecca turned to look out the window. When she looked back, something in her expression had shifted, not softened, not surrendered, but recalibrated. The way a chess player looks when they've realized their opponent made a move they didn't anticipate. Get me an independent engineer, she said. Someone with credentials the clients will recognize. Have them certify Sentinel by Sunday. That's a tight window. Then start tonight, she said. Miles left. Rebecca sat alone. She pulled up Daniel's personnel file for the second time that day. This time, she went further back. Not the recent reviews. The early ones. The ones from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the first 18 months when Daniel had been a senior engineer before his promotion to director. She read for a long time. Then she opened the Sentinel project history and did something she hadn't done before, something she should have done months ago, before promising investors a Monday launch date, before signing contracts across 5 states, before 11 months of assuming that the engine keeping this company's most important project running was the executive team she'd assembled. She read the actual technical documentation, not the summaries, not the executive reports that Miles brought to her in clean slide presentations. The actual documents, the time-stamped drafts, the comment threads between engineers, the recommendation memos buried 3 levels below the reports that reached her desk. And she started to see a pattern. The pattern was a name. It wasn't Miles's name, though. Miles's name appeared frequently at the top of summaries and presentation decks and executive briefings. It was the name that appeared in the substrata in the original drafts, in the technical recommendations in the comment threads, where problems were actually being solved. Daniel Mercer. Daniel Mercer had flagged a routing issue 14 months ago. The fix was implemented. The fix was presented to the board as a strategic decision by the infrastructure leadership team. Daniel Mercer had identified a vendor compliance gap 11 months ago. He'd resolved it directly, documented it thoroughly, and noted in the file that the resolution had prevented what his estimate called a potential $8 million exposure. The summary that reached Rebecca's desk described it as a vendor alignment initiative, successfully completed. No name attached. Daniel Mercer had written a 17-page technical analysis 8 months ago, recommending a phased approach to Sentinel's hospital network integration. The analysis was detailed, careful, and she could see now almost exactly correct in predicting the stress points that had emerged in his simulation last week. The analysis had been condensed to 4 bullet points in the executive briefing. The 4 bullet points were attributed to the infrastructure leadership team. Rebecca sat back in her chair. She thought about the 7 client calls. She thought about Gary Whitfield asking for Daniel specifically. She thought about the utility partner in Arizona who had requested a conversation with Daniel or his equivalent, a phrase that had seemed like a minor inconvenience at 4 o'clock, and now at 8:15 in the evening felt like a precise and devastating description of the situation. She had believed this morning that Daniel's leverage was his dependency, that a single father with a mortgage and a daughter to feed would ultimately choose security over dignity because the math required it. She had been wrong about the leverage entirely. His leverage wasn't his need. His leverage was the fact that 7 years of relationships and judgment and consistent competence could not be replaced by a memo and a press release. She picked up her phone. She almost called him. She put the phone back down. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to think. Tonight she needed to understand exactly how deep this went before she made a move that couldn't be taken back. She opened the project history again. She kept reading. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel was washing the dinner dishes. Sophie had gone to bed at 9 after finishing her homework and asking her father twice whether he was okay and receiving the same answer both times. Yes, I'm okay, go read your book. Which was the answer she'd expected, and the one she'd needed to hear in exactly that unworried tone. She was 10. She was perceptive. And she understood the way children who've been raised by someone honest tend to understand that her father wasn't performing calm. He actually was calm. That was either reassuring or terrifying, and she'd decided it was reassuring because the alternative required more energy than she had before bedtime. Daniel finished the dishes, dried his hands, poured 2 fingers of bourbon he'd been saving for no particular occasion, and sat at the kitchen table. His phone had been quiet since 7 o'clock. The HR calls had stopped. Miles had stopped. The only message he'd received in the past 2 hours was from an engineer named Tom Reyes, someone who had worked under Daniel for 3 years, that said simply, "You okay? Heard what happened. That was wrong." Daniel had written back, "I'm fine. Don't do anything on my account. Just do your job well." Tom had replied with a thumbs up. Daniel looked at the bourbon for a while without drinking it. He thought about the synchronization defect. He thought about the hospitals. He thought about the fact that he had put his recommendation in writing clearly and specifically, and that it had been dismissed not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the timing was inconvenient. He had done what he could do. Now it was out of his hands. The thought should have been more comforting than it was. Daniel was the kind of person who understood intellectually that you could only control what you could control, and that carrying responsibility for outcomes you'd been prevented from influencing was a form of punishment you inflicted on yourself. He knew that. He believed it. He still lay awake until nearly midnight thinking about the hospitals, and then at 12:07 a.m. a thought arrived that was separate from the worry underneath it, steadier, the kind of thought that comes when you've made a decision that costs something real and you're testing in the quiet dark whether you actually believe in it. He had made the right call. Not the safe call. Not the comfortable call. The right one. He had warned them. He had documented everything. He had asked for 4 days. And when the response was not engagement, but humiliation, when the counter-argument was not evidence, but a comment about his personal life, he had recognized that no version of staying would have changed what was fundamentally true about that room, about that leadership, about what his presence there was actually worth to the people running it. He picked up the bourbon. He took one sip. He put it down. He thought about Jonathan Vale's voice on the phone, steady and direct, and completely uninterested in anything except one question. Are you available? He went to bed. He slept without much difficulty, which surprised him and probably shouldn't have. In the morning, he made Sophie's lunch, drove her to school, and went to have breakfast with the CEO of North Star Energy Systems. The restaurant Jonathan Vale had chosen was the kind of place that doesn't need to advertise quiet tables, good coffee, the kind of staff who refill your water without being asked, and otherwise leave you alone. Jonathan was already there when Daniel arrived, sitting at a corner table with black coffee and no phone visible on the table, which told Daniel something immediately. A man who leaves his phone in his pocket during a breakfast meeting is a man who has decided this conversation is the most important thing happening right now. Jonathan Vale looked exactly like someone who had built a national company from the ground up and didn't particularly feel the need to look impressive. He was 51, heavyset without being soft with gray at his temples, and the kind of handshake that was firm without performing firmness. Daniel, he said. Jonathan, Daniel said. They ordered. Coffee for Daniel. More coffee for Jonathan. They both ordered eggs, which Daniel would later think was probably a good sign. A man who orders something real at a breakfast meeting is a man who isn't too nervous to eat. Jonathan waited until the server left before he said anything of substance. I heard you walked out, he said. I resigned, Daniel said. What's the difference? Walking out is anger, Daniel said. I wasn't angry. I was done. Jonathan looked at him for a moment. What did she say? She said I was nothing without the job. A pause. In front of the room, Jonathan asked. 14 people, Daniel said. Jonathan picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. She's been in the CEO seat 11 months. Yes. She promoted Miles Harrington to run her corporate strategy. Yes. Miles has been presenting your technical work as strategic initiatives for approximately, Jonathan paused. How long would you say? 18 months, 2 years. Daniel went still. He looked at Jonathan Vale across the table with the careful attention of someone reassessing the scope of a conversation they thought they understood. How do you know that? Daniel said. Because the work that's been coming out of Apex Grid's infrastructure division over the past 2 years has your fingerprints on it, Jonathan said simply. I've been in this industry a long time. I know what different kinds of thinking look like, and the thinking in those documents doesn't look like Miles Harrington. Daniel didn't respond immediately. I've been watching Apex Grid's technical output for 3 years, Jonathan continued. Since the Southern Colorado Grid event. Do you remember that? Daniel remembered it. A cascading failure in a regional utility network. 3 counties. 14 hours. Daniel had been on the phone for most of it, coordinating with utility operators and hospital administrators to maintain backup systems while the primary grid was restored. He'd slept 4 hours in 2 days. You're the one who kept St. Francis Hospital online, Jonathan said. Their facilities director told me. He said an Apex Grid engineer drove to the substation personally at 2 in the morning. The remote access was failing, Daniel said. Someone had to go. Someone, Jonathan said. That someone was you. Daniel said nothing. I tried to find out who you were at the time, Jonathan said. I was told the response was coordinated by Apex Grid's infrastructure leadership team. He said the phrase with a particular flatness that made its absurdity clear. It took me 8 more months to figure out the actual name. The eggs arrived. They both ate for a moment. I'm not interested in what you know about Apex Grid, Jonathan said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to bring me clients or contracts or inside information. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Daniel asked. Jonathan set his fork down. I'm building something, he said. North Star is the second largest emergency energy firm in the country. I want to be the most trusted, not the largest. The most trusted. There's a difference. The largest firm wins on price and volume. The most trusted firm is the one hospitals call first when they can't afford to get it wrong. He looked at Daniel directly. I've been looking for someone who understands the difference between those two things. Someone who will tell me when a plan is wrong before we commit to it. Not after. Before. Daniel held his gaze. What happens when you don't want to hear it? I expect you to prove it, Jonathan said. And if I do, then I change the plan. No hesitation, no performance. Just a man who had built something real stating plainly how he intended to keep building it. The table was quiet for a moment. The position, Jonathan said, is Executive Vice President of Critical Infrastructure. You'd have your own engineering team. Real authority over testing standards, certification protocols, and operational decisions. You'd have a seat at this table before commitments are made, not after. And you'd have a schedule that respects the fact that you have a daughter who needs a father home by 6. Daniel looked at his coffee. Compensation, Jonathan said, is 70% above what Apex Grid was paying you. Daniel looked up. I know what they were paying you, Jonathan said. I also know what you were worth. The number I'm offering reflects the second figure. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. You're not worried, he said finally, that I walked out of my last job yesterday morning without notice? No, Jonathan said. Why not? Because from everything I know about you, Jonathan said, yesterday morning was the first time in 7 years that Apex Grid gave you an actual reason to leave. He picked up his coffee. That's not instability, that's patience. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I'll need a week before I start. Sophie has a school thing. Jonathan almost smiled. Take 2. They shook hands across the table. By 9:30 a.m., less than 24 hours after Rebecca Sterling had told him he was nothing without his job, Daniel Mercer had accepted an executive position at her largest competitor at a level above anything Apex Grid had ever offered him, with the kind of authority he'd been exercising informally for 7 years without receiving credit for it. He drove home. He sat in his driveway for a moment. He called his sister in Portland because she was the person he called when something significant happened, and he needed to tell one person before it became real. I quit my job, he said when she picked up. Finally, she said immediately, and he actually laughed the first real laugh in 2 days, because she'd been telling him for 3 years that he was undervalued, and he'd been telling her for 3 years that it was complicated. I have a new one, he said. Silence. How new? She said. As of 45 minutes ago, he said. More silence. Daniel, she said. Yeah. You're going to be okay. I know, he said. And he meant it in a way he hadn't fully meant anything in a long time. At that exact moment, back at Apex Grid's headquarters, Rebecca Sterling received an email from Riverside Health Network's legal department formally requesting postponement of Sentinel's installation at all 4 of their facilities, pending independent technical review. She read it twice. Then she called Miles. He picked up on the first ring. Riverside just pulled their installation approval, she said. A pause that was 1 beat too long. I'll handle it, Miles said. Miles. Her voice was quiet and sharp at the same time. What have you not told me? The silence that followed was the answer. It lasted 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Rebecca Sterling understood with the particular clarity of someone who has just realized the ground beneath them is less stable than it appeared that Miles had given her a managed version of yesterday's reality, organized, professionally delivered, and strategically incomplete. Get in my office, she said. Now. He came. He sat. And this time because the room contained only the 2 of them, and because Riverside's email had made certain omissions impossible, he gave her the fuller picture. 7 clients. Not all requesting formal postponements yet, but all expressing the same concern in different language. Technical continuity. Certification confidence. The specific question of who was now accountable for the decisions Daniel Mercer had been making. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Miles finished, she said one thing. Why didn't you tell me all of this yesterday? Miles chose his words carefully. I didn't want to create panic over what I believed was manageable. And now, she said. He didn't answer. She looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, with the kind of assessment that is colder than anger. Pull every technical document from the past 2 years, she said. Every recommendation, every certification, every advisory memo. I want the original drafts, not the summaries. I want to see who actually wrote them. Miles's expression did something very small and very controlled. All of them, he said. Every one, Rebecca said. He left. She turned to her screen. She had one more thing to do. She opened a new email. She typed Daniel's name in the recipient field. She stared at it. Then she closed the window without writing anything. Not yet. She didn't know enough yet. She didn't know what she was going to offer, or what words she was going to use, or how she was going to frame a conversation with a man she had publicly humiliated in front of 14 people less than 36 hours ago. What she knew was this Apex Grid's most important contract was in jeopardy. Her clients were asking for a man she'd told she could replace. And somewhere in the documentation history of this company was evidence that the executive she trusted most had been taking credit for work done by the person she'd just let walk out the door. She needed facts before she moved. She opened the project files. She started reading. Claire Donovan, 3 floors down in the legal department, was also reading. She had been reading since 6:30 that morning, 2 hours before anyone else arrived, sitting alone at her desk with a large coffee and the full archive of Daniel's internal reports and communications going back 4 years. She was reading not because anyone had asked her to. Nobody had, but because she was general counsel, and because she had been in that conference room yesterday morning, and because what she had seen and heard had triggered something in her that she'd spent 22 years in corporate law learning to pay attention to. Her instinct was this: the company had a problem that was larger than a personnel change, and the shape of that problem was becoming clearer with every file she opened. She found the first one at 7:14 a.m. A routing protocol analysis from 14 months ago. Detailed. Technically rigorous. Daniel's name in the document, metadata, as sole author. The executive summary attached to it, the one that had reached the board, listed the analysis as a product of the infrastructure strategy team. Miles Harrington's name appeared at the top. She flagged it. She kept reading. By 8:45 she had flagged 9 documents. By 11:17, each one following the same pattern. Daniel's authorship in the metadata. A different name almost always Miles on the public-facing summary. Work done by one person, credit assigned to another. Claire sat back in her chair. She thought about what this meant legally. She thought about what it meant for the board. She thought about what it meant for Sentinel's liability exposure if the contract collapsed and someone started asking whose technical sign-off was actually behind the decisions that had led to it. Then she thought about the conference room. She thought about Daniel placing his badge on the table. She picked up her phone and called her counterpart at the company's outside counsel firm. I need to talk to you about something, she said. Informally, off the record for now. What's the subject? The attorney asked. Attribution fraud, Claire said. And potential liability for a contract failure tied to the person whose work was being misattributed. There was a pause. When can you come in? The attorney said. This afternoon, Claire said. She hung up. She looked at the 17 flagged documents on her screen. She thought about the way Daniel had answered Rebecca's question. Is that really how you see me, with the stillness of someone who had just made peace with something? She thought about what it had cost him to put that badge down. She opened a new file and started writing. Outside, in a city that had no idea any of this was happening, Daniel Mercer was picking Sophie up from school. She came through the front doors with her backpack on and spotted him immediately, which made her stop and squint slightly, because he was usually not the parent in the pickup line at 3:15 on a Friday. You're here, she said. I am, he said. She climbed into the passenger seat. Did something good happen? He thought about Jonathan Vale's handshake. He thought about the number on the offer. He thought about 2 words, I expect you to prove it, and the particular weight those words carried when said by someone who meant them. Yes, he said. Sophie looked at him sideways. "Are you going to tell me what—" "Eventually," he said. She rolled her eyes, which was the most 10-year-old response available to her, and then she said, "Can we get ice cream?" "Yes," he said. They got ice cream. I didn't check his phone. At 4:47 p.m., while Daniel and Sophie were sitting across from each other at a small table with 2 scoops each, Apex Grid's communications director sent a press release to the company's investor mailing list announcing leadership continuity and expressing full confidence in Project Sentinel's Monday launch timeline. At 5:03 p.m., North Star Energy Systems sent its own announcement to the same industry distribution list. It read in its entirety that North Star was pleased to announce the appointment of Daniel Mercer as Executive Vice President of Critical Infrastructure, effective immediately. The announcement included Daniel's 7 years of experience in emergency energy management, his background in infrastructure system design, and one additional line that was not standard in executive announcements, but that Jonathan Vail had insisted on including because he believed in being specific about what he valued. It said, "Daniel brings a record of technical integrity and client trust that we believe represents the highest standard in our industry." Rebecca Sterling read it at 5:09 p.m. She read it twice. She set her phone face down on her desk. She sat very still, less than 48 hours. Her largest competitor had just publicly placed the man she'd told was nothing at a level above anything. Apex Grid had offered him in 7 years, used the phrase technical integrity in the announcement, and sent it to every investor partner and client contact in the industry. She thought about Riverside Health Network's email. She thought about the 17 flagged documents Claire Donovan had just sent her. A preliminary summary of the email had arrived 20 minutes ago, and she hadn't fully processed what it meant yet, but she understood enough. She thought about Miles. She thought about a single father who had driven a 2-hour round trip to a substation at 2 in the morning to keep a hospital's backup systems online, and who had been described to her afterward as the infrastructure leadership team. She picked up her phone. She called Daniel. It rang 4 times. "Rebecca," he said when he answered. No warmth. No hostility. Just a man who had looked at the caller ID and decided to answer. "I saw the announcement," she said. "I expected you would." "I want to talk," she said. "We're talking," Daniel said. She took a breath. "I want to offer you a path back. We can discuss compensation level, whatever you need." "Rebecca," he said. She stopped. "I've accepted the position," he said. "I know. But if you'd be willing to—" "I'm not," he said simply. The line was quiet for a moment. "You owe this company something," she said. "After 7 years." And there it was, the same argument dressed differently, arriving at the same place. "You owe us. We made you." "I gave this company 7 years," Daniel said. His voice was the same voice it had been in the conference room. Level. Unhurried. The voice of a man who is not performing composure, but simply has it. "North Star wouldn't even know your name without Apex Grid," she said. A pause. "They knew my name," Daniel said, "before you did." He ended the call. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his kitchen. Then he went to check on Sophie's homework. The weekend passed. The way weekends do when the world outside is burning quietly and you've made a decision to let it burn without you. Daniel took Sophie to her soccer game Saturday morning. He stood on the sideline with a thermos of coffee and watched her chase the ball with the specific intensity of a child who had inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's speed, and he did not check his phone once. Not because he was disciplined about it in some practiced performative way. Because watching his daughter play soccer was the only thing happening in the world that mattered to him right now, and he had spent enough years dividing his attention between what was in front of him and what was waiting on a screen. He was done with that particular division. Sophie scored once, missed twice, and argued a call with the referee with a confidence that made the other parents laugh and made Daniel press his lips together to hide a smile. After the game, she asked him if they could go to the hardware store because she wanted to build something. He said yes. They spent 40 minutes in the hardware store, buying wood pieces and sandpaper and a small bottle of wood glue, and the teenager at the register asked Sophie what she was building, and she said a bookshelf for my dad's new office, and the teenager said, "Cool." And Daniel looked at his daughter and felt something settle in his chest that had no name, but was the opposite of everything he'd felt in that conference room Thursday morning. Saturday evening, while Sophie was in her room constructing something that would ultimately resemble a bookshelf if you were generous with your interpretation. Daniel got a text from Tom Reyes. Tom was one of his former engineers at Apex Grid, one of the good ones. The kind of engineer who asked questions because he wanted to understand rather than because he wanted to seem engaged. The text said, Sentinel failed the independent stress test. Brought in an outside firm Friday night. Results came back this morning. Management is not happy. Daniel read it once. Typed back, don't get involved in the politics. Just keep doing good work. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went to help Sophie with her bookshelf, which was listing approximately 15 degrees to the left. At Apex Grid headquarters, nobody was having a quiet Saturday. Rebecca Sterling had called Miles into the office at 8 in the morning. Not a request. A directive delivered by text at 7:43 a.m., with no punctuation and no greeting. Which was how Miles had learned to identify the difference between a Rebecca who was managing a situation and a Rebecca who was in the early stages of understanding how serious a situation actually was. He arrived to find her already at her desk, with 3 monitors active and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. The coffee on her desk was cold, which meant she'd been there since at least 6. She looked up when he walked in and said without any preamble whatsoever, "The independent firm failed Sentinel." Miles stopped walking. "All modules," he said. "The backup distribution routing," she said. "The synchronization defect Daniel flagged." Miles sat down slowly. "The exact failure point," Rebecca said, "that Daniel requested 4 additional days to test. The exact failure point that I dismissed in front of 14 people because the launch was Monday and the investors were scheduled." She looked at Miles with the flat, careful attention of someone who is holding something very large, very still. "The failure point that you told me was manageable." "I said the client concerns were manageable," Miles said. "I didn't." "Miles." Her voice went quiet, the kind of quiet that is louder than volume. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I am about to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, and I need to tell you that Claire Donovan has spent the last 2 days reviewing document histories that I should have reviewed myself a long time ago." Miles went still. "The routing protocol analysis from 14 months ago," Rebecca said. "The one presented to the board as an infrastructure strategy initiative. Who wrote it?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was long enough. "I synthesized it from," Miles began. "Who wrote the original draft?" Rebecca said. Another silence. "Daniel provided technical input," Miles said carefully. "Daniel wrote it," Rebecca said. "His name is in the metadata. Claire has the file. She has 17 files, Miles. 17 documents over 2 years, where Daniel's name is in the metadata and your name is on the summary that reached me." Miles looked at the desk. "Do you understand what that means?" Rebecca said. "Not just for you, for the company. We have a $620 million contract in jeopardy, clients pulling installation approvals, an independent firm confirming a defect that our own director flagged, and we dismissed. And now our legal counsel is sitting on evidence that the technical work behind this entire project was being misattributed for 2 years, while the person who actually did it was being told he lacked executive presence." She said it all in one breath, and when she finished, the office was completely silent. Miles said nothing. "I want you to tell me." Rebecca said exactly how this started, and I want the truth, because Claire is going to find it either way, and the only thing that changes between you telling me now and me finding it in a document is whether I consider you part of the solution going forward. Miles looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel was never interested in visibility." Rebecca stared at him. "He genuinely didn't care who got credit," Miles said. "He cared whether the work was right. He cared whether the system was safe. He cared about the result. So when I started presenting his analyses in leadership meetings, he didn't object. He was in the room sometimes. He'd add technical detail when I asked. It was," he paused, "collaborative, at first." "At first," Rebecca repeated. It grew, Miles said. It became the pattern. And I told myself it was because I was translating his technical work into strategic language that leadership could act on, that I was adding value. Were you? Rebecca said. The question sat between them. Not as much as I told myself, Miles said quietly. Rebecca stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment. You told me 6 months ago that Daniel lacked executive presence, she said. That he wasn't ready for VP level. Miles said nothing. You wrote a memo, she said. I signed it. I signed the memo that blocked Daniel's promotion based on your assessment of his executive presence. She turned around. And now I'm looking at 17 documents that show he was doing executive-level work for 2 years while you were presenting it as yours. She walked back to her desk. Get out of my office, she said. I need to talk to legal. Don't go anywhere. Don't make any calls. Don't touch any files. Miles left. Rebecca sat down. She put her hands flat on the desk, looked at the wall for a moment, and then picked up the phone and called Claire Donovan. Claire answered immediately. How many does it go back? Rebecca said. I'm still counting, Claire said. But the pattern starts approximately 22 months ago, maybe earlier. What's our liability exposure? Significant, Claire said. If Sentinel fails and the hospitals bring claims and it comes out in discovery that the engineer who flagged the defect was silenced and then forced out, we have a serious problem. The documentation trail is, Rebecca, it's very clear. Daniel raised the issue. It was dismissed. He resigned under duress. The argument that it was his professional decision to leave gets complicated when the other side shows a CEO telling him he was nothing without his job in a room full of witnesses. Rebecca pressed her fingers to her forehead. The board, Claire said. They need to know, before this goes further. I know, Rebecca said. Soon, Claire said. I know, Rebecca said again. She hung up. She sat for a long time. Then she did something she had been resisting since Friday afternoon. She picked up her phone and called Daniel again. He answered on the third ring. She could hear something in the background, a child's voice, some kind of movement, the ordinary texture of a Saturday afternoon in a house where a 10-year-old was doing something constructive and chaotic. Rebecca, he said. I need to tell you something, she said. A pause. Go ahead. The independent firm confirmed your finding, she said. Sentinel failed the stress test, the synchronization defect. You were right. Silence. I'm sorry, she said. And then, because she had committed to being honest, at least in this moment, she added, I should have listened Thursday. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Is the Monday launch postponed? He said. Yes. Good, he said. Just that. Not I told you so. Not any version of satisfaction or vindication. Just the word good in the tone of someone who cares about the outcome and not about being seen caring about it. I want to discuss, Rebecca began. Rebecca, Daniel said. I appreciate the call, I do, but I've accepted the North Star position and I'm not coming back. If you need technical cooperation on the Sentinel remediation, if there's something specific related to the routing protocol documentation, you can have your team contact me through North Star's channels and I'll see what I can do. But I'm not available for a general discussion about returning. Another pause. There are hospitals involved, Rebecca said. A last card played carefully. I know, Daniel said. That's why I raised it Thursday. And it's why I'm willing to help with the remediation through proper channels. But it's not why I'm going to walk back through your door. She didn't have an answer for that. Take care of the hospitals, Daniel said. That's what matters right now. He hung up. Rebecca stared at her phone. Outside her office window, Denver went about its Saturday. She had one more call to make, and she'd been putting it off since Friday evening. The board chair. The conversation she'd been hoping to delay until she had more information, more control over the narrative, more ability to present this situation as something she was managing rather than something that had escaped management. She made the call. The board chair listened without interrupting, which was either very good or very bad, and Rebecca had learned enough to know it was probably the second. When she finished, there was a long pause. How many clients have formally postponed? He said. 4, she said. 2 more informally. And the technical failure was documented in Daniel Mercer's report before the launch decision. Yes. Which you overrode? Yes. Another pause. And the attribution issue Claire has identified, he said. The 17 documents. Potentially more, she said. Rebecca, he said. I'm going to call an emergency board session Monday morning. I need you to have Claire prepare a full briefing. Everything. The technical report, the attribution review, the client status, the remediation plan. A pause. And I need you to understand that the board is going to have questions that I won't be able to redirect. I understand, she said. Monday, he said. 8 a.m. The call ended. Rebecca put the phone down. For the first time in 11 months. In this role, she felt the particular weight of a situation that had moved beyond her ability to contain it through competence alone. This was going to require something else. She wasn't entirely sure she knew what that was yet. Across town. Daniel had returned to the bookshelf project. Sophie had declared the 15-degree lean a design feature, which Daniel had accepted without argument, because she was not wrong that it gave the piece character. He was helping her sand the edges when his phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan Vale. It said, Board of Directors approved your appointment this morning. Full team briefing Monday at 9. Welcome to North Star. Daniel read it. Put the phone back in his pocket. Good news, Sophie said. Yes, he said. New job, good news, or regular good news? New job, he said. She nodded like this was satisfying information and went back to sanding. She was quiet for a moment, moving the sandpaper in the slow circles he'd shown her, and then she said without looking up, Are they going to be nicer to you there? Daniel thought about Jonathan Vale ordering eggs at a breakfast table and leaving his phone in his pocket and saying then, I changed the plan without rehearsing it. Yes, he said. I think they are. Monday arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a difficult weekend. The sense of a situation that has been turning over in the dark and finally arrives at something solid. Daniel drove to North Star's headquarters for the first time. The building was different from Apex Grid's glass tower 4 floors practical. The kind of building that says we spend money on work rather than appearance. Jonathan's assistant met him at reception and walked him to a conference room where 7 people were already seated, and a whiteboard was covered in infrastructure diagrams that Daniel immediately recognized as North Star's Western grid architecture. Jonathan was at the head of the table. Everyone, Jonathan said, this is Daniel Mercer. He's going to be running critical infrastructure. I want you to treat his technical sign-off as a requirement, not a courtesy. He looked at Daniel. You want to say anything before we start? Daniel looked around the table. Engineers mostly. A couple of operations people. People who looked like they built things for a living and were comfortable being judged by whether the things they built actually worked. Just one thing, Daniel said. If you see a problem, tell me. Don't wait until it's convenient. Don't wait until you think I want to hear it. Tell me when you see it, and we'll figure it out together. He paused. That's it. Jonathan nodded once. Let's get to work. For the first 2 hours of that Monday morning, Daniel sat in a room full of people who asked him genuine questions and waited for genuine answers, and he felt something he hadn't felt inside a conference room in longer than he wanted to calculate. He felt useful, not tolerated, not managed, not leveraged and quietly diminished while someone else collected the credit. Useful. Actually straightforwardly, productively useful. Meanwhile, 8 blocks away, Apex Grid's emergency board session was beginning. The board chair sat at the head of a different conference table, the same one where Daniel had placed his badge 5 days earlier, and opened the meeting with a single statement. We're here because a $620 million contract is in jeopardy. A technical warning was overridden without adequate review, and we have evidence of systematic misattribution of technical work over approximately 2 years. I want to hear from legal first. Claire Donovan stood. She had prepared the briefing with the same care she brought to everything organized, evidence-based, free of editorializing, and therefore completely devastating in the way that honest accountings of dishonest situations tend to be devastating. She walked the board through 22 months of documentation. She showed them the original files and the summaries that replaced them. She showed them the metadata. She showed them the memo blocking Daniel's promotion, signed by Rebecca, recommended by Miles. She showed them Daniel's original Sentinel warning, time-stamped and specific. And this was the detail that made two board members lean forward, almost exactly confirmed by the independent firm's stress test results 4 days later. She presented it all without raising her voice. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then one of the board members, a man who had been in energy infrastructure for 30 years and had the particular patience of someone who has watched companies fail slowly from the inside, said, "Where is Daniel Mercer now?" Claire said, "He accepted the EVP of Critical Infrastructure position at North Star Energy Systems Friday morning." The board member nodded slowly. "Jonathan Vail hired him?" "Yes." The board member looked at Rebecca. "Jonathan Vail has been watching Apex Grid's technical output for years. He told me that at a conference in Phoenix. Said he thought someone on your team was doing exceptional work." He paused. "He apparently found out who." Rebecca sat very still. "The attribution issue," another board member said to Claire. "What are we looking at in terms of liability? If we proceed to litigation, either from client claims related to Sentinel or from Daniel Mercer personally, the documentation trail creates significant exposure," Claire said. "The cleaner path legally and reputationally is a proactive remediation. That means addressing the Sentinel defect, immediately being transparent with clients about the delay and its cause, and separately addressing the internal attribution issue through whatever HR and legal process is appropriate." "And Miles Harrington," the board chair said. "That's a board decision," Claire said. The board chair looked at Rebecca. Rebecca said, "He's suspended pending the outcome of this review." "That's a start," the board chair said. The session continued for another 2 hours. By the time it ended, 3 decisions had been made. First, Miles Harrington's suspension would become a formal investigation with outside counsel. Second, Sentinel's Monday launch was officially postponed, indefinitely pending a full technical review. Third, Rebecca's authority over technical operations would be temporarily overseen by an independent technical committee while the investigation proceeded. That last decision was delivered by the board chair in the particular tone of someone who is telling a CEO that the board still believes in them, but needs to demonstrate that belief through constraints rather than declarations. Rebecca accepted it without argument. She didn't have the standing to argue. When the board members filed out, she sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The same room. The same table. The spot where Daniel's badge had been was still vaguely present in her memory, the way the specific location of significant events tends to stay mapped on a space. She thought about what the board member had said. Jonathan Vail had been watching for years. He'd been looking for the person doing the exceptional work. He'd found out who. She had spent 11 months in this building, convinced that the value this company offered its people was the primary leverage in every relationship. She was beginning to understand that she had the equation exactly backwards. The company hadn't made Daniel valuable. Daniel had been making the company valuable. And now he was making a different company valuable. She stood up. She had a Sentinel remediation meeting in 20 minutes. Without Miles. Without Daniel. With an engineering team that was competent, but that had been for 2 years, working in the shadow of a dynamic she was only now fully comprehending. She walked down the hall toward the meeting. She passed Daniel's old office. The door was open. The desk was clean. Someone had already begun moving files. She kept walking. At North Star. Daniel's first day was ending the way good. First days end with more clarity than confusion, more momentum than uncertainty, and the sense of having made a decision that was going to cost something, but was absolutely the right decision. I was finishing a review of North Star's current hospital network contracts when one of the engineers, a woman named Priya, who had introduced herself that morning as the person who would tell him when something was wrong and expected the same in return, which had immediately made him trust her, knocked on his open office door. "You have a minute," she said. "Yes," he said. She came in and sat down and said, "I want to ask you something directly, and tell me if it's out of line." "Go ahead," Daniel said. "The Sentinel situation at Apex Grid," she said. "We've all heard about it. Is there anything there that affects our hospital network contracts? Any overlap in the defect pattern? Daniel looked at her. It was a good question. A serious question. The kind of question that people who care about outcomes ask before they're required to, not after. I reviewed our architecture this afternoon, Daniel said. Our synchronization protocol is different. The exposure isn't the same. But I want to run a simulation this week to be certain, and I want you involved in the parameters. Priya nodded. I'll set it up tomorrow. Good, Daniel said. Then, that was exactly the right question to ask. I figured, she said, and left. Daniel sat for a moment. He thought about the 14 people in Apex Grid's conference room 5 days ago. I thought about the fact that not one of them had asked that question before the Monday launch date. He thought about what it cost an organization to build a culture where the obvious question goes unasked, because the person with the authority to override the answer has already decided. Then he closed his laptop. Sophie had a school thing Wednesday. He'd promised he'd be there. He could be there. Nobody was going to make him choose between the promise and the job. That was the difference. Not the title, not the compensation, not even the authority. Though the authority mattered. The difference was that at North Star, being the kind of father who shows up for his daughter's school events was not evidence against his ambition. It was simply part of who he was. And who he was, it turned out, was exactly what they'd hired. 2 days later, Daniel's phone rang during his lunch break. Number he didn't recognize. He answered. Mr. Mercer, a woman said. My name is Helen Park. I'm the facilities director at Mountain West Medical Center. We're one of Apex Grid's contracted Sentinel sites. Daniel said, Ms. Park. I'm calling because we're trying to make decisions about our infrastructure timeline, and I know this is unusual, I wanted to speak directly with you. How did you get this number? Daniel said. Gary Whitfield, she said. Riverside Health. He said you'd answer. Daniel considered this for a moment. Gary had given him more credit than was comfortable and less than he deserved, which was about right. What can I help you with? Daniel said. We have 4 ICUs and 2 surgical suites on the Sentinel network, Helen Park said. The failure mode you identified, the simultaneous backup node overload, if that triggered during a procedure. We're talking about a patient safety event. I need to understand the actual risk level, not the corporate reassurance language. I need someone who will tell me the truth. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Ms. Park, he said. I need to be transparent with you about something. I no longer work for Apex Grid. I'm now at North Star Energy Systems. So I'm limited in what I can formally tell you about Apex Grid's system. I know, she said. I read the announcement. That's why I called you, because you left. The implication was clear. He left because he wasn't willing to tell them the system was safe when it wasn't. And she was calling him because she needed to know whether it was safe. Here's what I can tell you, Daniel said carefully. The defect I identified was real. It's been confirmed by an independent review. Apex Grid has postponed the launch. If your facility is already operating on an early deployment of the Sentinel network, I would strongly recommend requesting an immediate technical audit of your backup distribution nodes before relying on the system for critical procedures. That recommendation has nothing to do with North Star or Apex Grid. It's about your patients. A pause. Thank you, Helen Park said quietly. That's the first honest answer I've gotten in a week. You deserve honest answers, Daniel said. After he hung up, he sat for a moment. Then he called Jonathan Vale's direct line. Jonathan picked up. I just spoke with a hospital facilities director, Daniel said. Mountain West Medical. She's one of Apex Grid's Sentinel sites. She has real safety concerns. She called me directly because she couldn't get straight answers. What did you tell her? Jonathan said. The truth, Daniel said. Within the limits of what I can appropriately say. Good, Jonathan said. I want to flag this formally, Daniel said. If other hospital facilities start calling, and I think they might, I need a clear protocol for how we handle those calls. I won't misuse those conversations to pull clients. But I won't lie to hospital administrators about patient safety risks either. Agreed on both counts, Jonathan said without hesitation. Get with legal today and set up a protocol. Patient safety comes first, Competitive concerns come second. Thank you, Daniel said. He called North Star's general counsel immediately after. By the end of the day, a protocol existed. By the end of the week, 4 more hospital facilities would call. Daniel answered every one. He gave them honest information. He did not pitch North Star's services. He did not disparage Apex Grid. He told them what they needed to know to protect their patients, and he told them who they needed to pressure to get their systems audited. None of that was about Rebecca Sterling. All of it was about the fact that he was the same person on Tuesday that he'd been on Thursday, the same person who drove to a substation at 2 in the morning because someone had to, and that person's first obligation was always to the people the system was supposed to protect. The hospitals remembered that. Word travels in the facilities management community with the particular efficiency of professionals who depend on each other's recommendations for high-stakes decisions. By the end of the second week, North Star's business development team reported that 3 hospital networks had made unsolicited inquiries about North Star's infrastructure services. Daniel had not contacted a single one. Jonathan mentioned it to him in passing one morning. I know, Daniel said. I didn't. I know you didn't, Jonathan said. That's why it's working. Rebecca's third call to Daniel came on a Thursday morning exactly 1 week after she'd placed his badge on the conference table in her mind and begun understanding everything she'd been looking at wrong. She didn't call to offer him the job back this time. She said, "The board has asked me to request your cooperation on the Sentinel Technical Review, formally through North Star. Jonathan has already agreed in principle. I wanted to call you directly first." Daniel said, "I appreciate that." "Will you cooperate?" she said. "Yes," he said. "For the hospitals. Whatever the system needs to be safe, I'll help make it safe. That was always the goal." A pause. Rebecca said, "Daniel, I want to—" She stopped, started again. "I said something to you that I can't take back." Daniel waited. "You were right about everything," she said. "The defect, the delay, all of it. And what I said to you personally was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I said it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Why did you say it?" he asked. Rebecca considered this. "Because I thought it would work," she said. "I thought you'd calculate the risk and choose the job." "I did calculate the risk," Daniel said. "I know," she said. "I just didn't understand what you were calculating." The line was quiet. "I accept the apology," Daniel said. "I'll cooperate with the technical review. Have your team contact North Star's legal department and we'll set up a process." He ended the call. He sat in his new office in a building that didn't look impressive and in a chair that was slightly too small for his desk, and with a team 3 floors down who had already proven they would ask the right questions before someone made them. He thought about the woman at Mountain West Medical, saying, "That's the first honest answer I've gotten in a week." He thought about Sophie sanding the edges of her crooked bookshelf. He thought about Jonathan Vale ordering eggs and leaving his phone in his pocket. He picked up his coffee. He had a simulation to run. The hospitals needed a system that worked. That was enough. That had always been enough. The meeting had been scheduled for 10 days. Both companies knew it was coming. The hospital consortium's 7 major health networks across 4 western states, collectively responsible for more than 60 critical care facilities, had formally requested a joint technical presentation. They wanted Apex Grid and North Star in the same room at the same time, presenting competing remediation plans for the Sentinel situation, and they wanted answers that came from engineers rather than lawyers. The invitation had gone out on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, every executive at both companies understood what it actually was. Not a technical briefing, a judgment. The consortium was going to look at both companies side by side and decide who they trusted with the infrastructure protecting their patients. The contract implications ran north of $400 million. Rebecca had spent the 10 days preparing with the focused intensity of someone who understands that a single meeting can define a year. She brought in an outside technical firm. She restructured her presentation team. She personally reviewed every slide, every data point, every claim. She was not going to walk into that room underprepared. What she hadn't fully accounted for was who was going to walk in behind Jonathan Vale. The consortium meeting was held at Mountain West Medical Center's main campus neutral ground, chosen deliberately on Helen Park's recommendation. The conference room seated 30. By the time both delegations arrived, every seat was taken. Jonathan Vale arrived first at 9:48 a.m. He came in the way. Jonathan Vale came into most rooms without announcement, without performance, with the settled confidence of someone who has spent decades being the least impressed person in any given space. He shook hands with Helen Park, nodded to the consortium's legal team, and took a seat on the left side of the table. He did not sit at the head. He sat in the middle. The seat at the head of the table on North Star's side, he left open. Rebecca arrived at 9:53 with her team. 3 executives, 2 engineers from the outside technical firm, and a communications director who had spent the past week crafting language that was simultaneously apologetic and reassuring without being either one in a way that could be used against them in court. They took seats on the right side. Rebecca sat at the head of her delegation, which was where she always sat, because she had learned long ago that the person who sits at the head controls the frame. She looked across at Jonathan. Jonathan nodded at her, professionally, without warmth or hostility. She nodded back. The consortium's chair, a man named Robert Ellison, who ran the largest hospital network in the group, and who had the particular manner of someone who has sat through 1,000 presentations and learned to identify the difference between confidence and accuracy. Within the first 3 minutes, looked at both delegations. "We appreciate both companies being here," he said. "I want to be direct about what we need from this meeting. We have patients in ICUs and surgical suites whose safety depends on backup power infrastructure. We had a system we were told was ready. It wasn't. We want to understand what happened, what the current status is, and who we should trust going forward." He paused. "We'll hear from Apex Grid first, then North Star, and then we're going to have a conversation about what comes next." Rebecca stood. She had done this 100 times. Walked into high-stakes rooms and made the situation look manageable. She was good at it. Better than almost anyone she knew. She spoke for 22 minutes, hitting every point she'd rehearsed, acknowledging the defect without dwelling on it, presenting the remediation timeline with appropriate technical specificity, and framing Apex Grid's path forward in language that was honest enough to be credible and organized enough to be reassuring. When she finished, Robert Ellison said, "Thank you." He looked at the North Star side of the table. Jonathan Vale did not stand. Instead, he turned slightly toward the door. Which was the moment Rebecca Sterling understood that something was about to happen that she had not fully prepared for. The door opened, and Daniel Mercer walked in. I was not carrying Jonathan's papers. He was not standing behind him. He walked through the door and across the room with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going and does not need anyone to make space for them. He set his laptop and a single folder on the table and sat in the chair Jonathan had left open the head of the North Star side and looked at Robert Ellison. "Mr. Ellison," he said. "Helen, thank you for the invitation." Helen Park across the room said, "Thank you for coming, Daniel." Rebecca stared at him, not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. The particular expression of someone looking at a situation they had created themselves and seeing it clearly for the first time. She had told him he was nothing without the job. How was sitting at the head of the table at her competitor's presentation, in a room she had walked into expecting to control, and the hospital administrators were greeting him by his first name. Jonathan Vale said, "Our Executive Vice President of Critical Infrastructure will present North Star's technical assessment." Daniel opened his laptop. He spoke for 26 minutes. He did not tear Apex Grid apart. That was the thing that surprised everyone in the room, who had been expecting the satisfaction of watching a man take the revenge he had clearly earned. He presented the Sentinel defect with technical precision, what it was, what caused it, what conditions would trigger it, and what the correct remediation looked like. He used clear language. He did not catastrophize. He showed his work. When he got to the remediation section, he said, "What Apex Grid described this morning is substantially correct in its technical approach. The phased testing protocol they've outlined will address the core defect if it's executed without shortcuts. The timeline they've proposed is tighter than I'd be comfortable with, But it's not impossible if the team prioritizes the synchronization module above everything else. Silence in the room. Rebecca blinked. He was helping her. Not effusively. Not performatively. He was sitting across from the woman who had publicly humiliated him in front of the clients who were deciding both companies' futures, and he was telling them the truth, including the parts of the truth that didn't benefit Northstar and didn't punish Apex Grid. Robert Ellison leaned forward. "Daniel, you flagged this defect before the original launch date." "Yes," Daniel said. "And the launch proceeded anyway." "Yes." "What should have happened?" Ellison said. Daniel looked at him directly. "The 96 hours I requested should have been granted. The simulation results should have been reviewed by the full technical team. The decision about the launch timeline should have included the engineer responsible for the architecture, not just the executive responsible for the investor call." He said it without heat, without drama. He said it the way you say a true thing when the true thing is what the room needs to hear. Robert Ellison sat back. He looked at Rebecca. Rebecca said, "That's accurate." 3 words. No defense, no context, no corporate language. Ellison nodded slowly. The room went into discussion mode. Questions and answers, technical details, logistics. Daniel and one of Apex Grid's outside engineers ended up talking directly for 20 minutes about the routing protocol. 2 people who cared about the same problem, working toward the same answer, and everyone else in the room watched it happen. At one point, Apex Grid's engineer said, "If we implement the patch the way you're describing, we'd need to retest the full backup cascade." Daniel said, "Yes, that's the point." The engineer thought about it. "That adds 6 days." "I know," Daniel said. "Add them." The engineer looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at Daniel. Then she looked at her engineer. "Add them," she said. It was the first time in the entire Sentinel process that she had agreed with Daniel about a timeline without being forced into it. Something shifted in the room when she said it. Something small, but real. After the formal presentations ended, Robert Ellison called a recess. The consortium members gathered in a separate room. Both company delegations waited in the corridor. Rebecca found herself standing 12 feet from Daniel Mercer for the first time since he'd walked out of her conference room 2 weeks ago. She looked at him. He looked back. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "The remediation assessment. The part about our timeline being viable." "Yes, I did," Daniel said. "It helped us," she said. "It helped the hospitals," he said. "That's different." She studied him for a moment. "You know they're going to split the contract." "Probably," he said. "Northstar gets the expansion work," she said. "We keep the existing installation with oversight requirements." "That's a reasonable outcome," he said. "For you," she said. "For the patients," he said. Rebecca looked at her shoes for a moment, then back at him. "I've been reading your reports," she said. "The originals, not the summaries. The actual documents going back 3 years." Daniel waited. "I don't know how I didn't see it," she said. "You were looking at what Miles showed you," Daniel said. "He showed you what he wanted you to see." "I should have looked further," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "You should have." Not unkindly, not harshly, just honestly. The way he said everything. "Miles is terminated," Rebecca said. "The board made it formal this morning." Daniel nodded once. He didn't say anything about that. "There's going to be a restructuring," Rebecca said. "Technical oversight goes to an independent committee. No executive can override a documented safety warning without a review process." She paused. "It's essentially the protocol you asked for 2 years ago." Something moved in Daniel's face. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. "Good," he said. "Your departure created the change you couldn't create while you were there," she said. He looked at her. "I know." Robert Ellison appeared in the doorway. "We're ready," he said. They went back in. The consortium's decision took 11 minutes to present. Ellison delivered it with the directness of someone who has made a hard call and is comfortable explaining it. Apex Grid would retain the existing Sentinel installations subject to a mandatory remediation process that included independent technical certification at each stage. The timeline would be extended to incorporate Daniel's recommended testing protocols. An oversight committee, including a representative from the consortium's own technical team, would have sign-off authority at each major milestone. North Star would receive the contract for the consortium's next phase of infrastructure expansion: 3 new hospital networks, 2 airport facilities, a combined value of approximately $220 million. The project would be led by Daniel Mercer, with quarterly reviews tied to measurable patient safety metrics. When Ellison finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Helen Park said, "Daniel, I want to say something directly." He looked at her. "You called me back when you didn't have to," she said. "You gave me honest information when the easier thing was to protect yourself. That matters. That's why we made the decision we made." Daniel said, "You were asking the right questions. You deserved answers." She nodded. "Yes, we did." The meeting ended. People filed out. Hands were shaken. Logistics were exchanged. Jonathan Vale fell into step beside Daniel in the hallway. "Good morning's work," Jonathan said. "We'll see," Daniel said. "The real work starts now." "It always does," Jonathan said. They walked out together. Behind them, Rebecca Sterling stood in the doorway of the conference room for a moment, watching the hallway clear. Her team was gathering their materials, exchanging quiet words, doing the post-meeting work of people who had come out of a difficult situation in a position they could work with. She had not lost everything today. She had not won everything either. What she had was a clear accounting finally completely of what had happened inside her company and why. She had a board mandate for change. She had a remediation path. She had, if she was honest with herself, a sharper understanding of what leadership actually required than she had arrived with 11 months ago. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She thought about Miles's memo. The one she'd signed. The one that called Daniel's executive presence insufficient. She thought about Jonathan Vale leaving his phone in his pocket during a breakfast meeting. She thought about 7 hospital administrators greeting Daniel by his first name. She thought about 4 words, "I expect you to prove it," and what it meant to lead a company where those words were the actual policy, rather than something that lived in an orientation document nobody read. She started the car. She had a board call in an hour. She had a company to rebuild. And she was going to do it differently starting this afternoon, because the morning had shown her as clearly as anything she'd seen in 11 months, exactly what it cost when you didn't. The board call that afternoon ran 90 minutes. Rebecca presented the consortium's decision without softening it. She told the board exactly what had been decided, what it meant for Sentinel's timeline, and what it cost in terms of new contract opportunity. She told them about the oversight requirements. She told them the changes she was implementing. The board chair listened to all of it and then said, "Rebecca, what changed in that meeting this morning?" She thought about the question for a moment. "I stopped presenting and started listening," she said. A pause. "That's a start," the board chair said. After the call, Claire Donovan came to Rebecca's office. She knocked on the open door, which she always did, even though Rebecca's door was almost always open. It was a courtesy that Rebecca had never particularly noticed before, and noticed now. "How are you?" Claire said. "Working," Rebecca said. Claire sat down. She had a folder with her, which meant this wasn't just a check-in. "The Miles investigation," Claire said. "Outside counsel finished the preliminary review." "And," Rebecca said. Claire set the folder on the desk. "The attribution issue is more extensive than 17 documents," she said. "It goes back 26 months. And," she paused, "there's something else." Rebecca looked at her. "The memo blocking Daniel's promotion," Claire said. "The one recommending against VP level. Outside counsel found email correspondence between Miles and one of our board liaisons from around the same time." "What kind of correspondence?" Rebecca said. "Miles was concerned," Claire said carefully. That if Daniel was promoted to VP level, his direct access to board members would make the attribution dynamic, the pattern of presenting Daniel's work as team output, much harder to maintain. Rebecca stared at her. He blocked the promotion, Rebecca said. Not a question. He recommended against it in a way that ensured it would be denied, Claire said. And the reason had nothing to do with executive presence. The office was completely still. Rebecca thought about the memo. She had read it. She had agreed with it. She had signed it and moved to the next item on her agenda, because she trusted the judgment of the person presenting the information and had not looked behind the presentation to the motivation underneath it. She had been managed by someone she was supposed to be managing. Daniel should have been promoted 2 years ago, she said. Yes, Claire said. He was blocked because Miles was protecting himself. Yes, Claire said. Rebecca stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment. What does outside counsel recommend? She said. Termination is already done, Claire said. The question is whether this rises to a level that creates personal liability for Miles beyond the employment relationship. They think it might. Let them pursue it, Rebecca said. Whatever they recommend. There's one more thing, Claire said. Rebecca turned. The board is going to ask whether you want to reach out to Daniel, Claire said. Not to offer him his job back, that's done, everyone knows that. But formally, on the record, acknowledging what happened. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Not because it helps us legally, Claire said. Because it's right. Rebecca looked at her. I know, she said. I've known that since the morning he walked out. She sat back down at her desk. Set it up, she said. A private meeting. His terms, his schedule. Whatever he's willing to agree to. Claire nodded. She stood to leave. Claire, Rebecca said. Claire paused in the doorway. Why didn't you say something earlier? Rebecca said. About the documents. About the pattern. Your general counsel. You had access to the same files. Claire looked at her. I didn't have reason to look until I watched you tell him he was nothing, she said. And then I had every reason. She left. Rebecca sat alone in her office. The afternoon light was changing. She could hear the building settling around her, the ordinary sounds of a workday ending. People collecting things, conversations, trailing off, the particular quiet that falls over an office when the urgent becomes the merely difficult. She thought about Daniel making his daughter's lunch. She thought about him driving to a substation at 2 a.m. She thought about an engineer named Tom Reyes texting a man who'd just resigned. That was wrong. She had built her understanding of Daniel Mercer on what Miles had shown her, on what the summaries said, on the gap between what she saw and what actually existed. A gap she had never thought to question, because the person filling it was articulate and ambitious and told her what she wanted to hear. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the strategy and the quarterly numbers and the investor calls and the very expensive conference table, there had been a man quietly keeping everything working, not asking for credit, not performing loyalty, just doing the thing that needed doing the way he'd always done it, with the steady discipline of someone who understands that the work is the point. She had looked at all of that and seen someone who needed what she offered. She had been looking at the wrong thing. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, Daniel Mercer's office, confirmed. He's available Thursday at 7 a.m. before his first meeting. Rebecca read it. 7 a.m. before his first meeting. He was giving her 30 minutes on the front edge of his day because he was willing to have the conversation but was not going to rearrange his schedule for it. She typed back, confirm Thursday. 7 a.m., his location. She put the phone down. She had 4 days. She didn't need them to prepare a presentation. She wasn't walking into Thursday's meeting with slides or an agenda or a communication strategy. She was walking in with one thing: the truth. Not the managed version. Not the version that made her look like she'd been misled and bore only partial responsibility. The complete version, the one that acknowledged that a pattern this extensive doesn't survive without a leader who doesn't look closely enough at the things she should have been looking at. She owed him that. Not because it helped Apex Grid, because it was the only thing left that was actually hers to give. Meanwhile, all across the city, Daniel was at Sophie's school. He sat in a small chair in a third-grade-sized auditorium and watched his daughter perform in her class's science presentation, a project on renewable energy that she had worked on for 3 weeks, and that involved a model of a solar-powered water filtration system that functioned barely but genuinely, which was the kind of barely but genuinely that deserves more credit than perfect things that never get tested. Sophie spotted him when she walked on stage. Her expression did the thing. It always did. A quick flash of surprise that he was there, followed immediately by the careful composure of a 10-year-old who did not want anyone to see that it mattered. It mattered. Daniel watched his daughter explain her project to a room full of parents and other children, with the specific confidence of someone who built the thing and therefore knows it from the inside. And he thought about what Helen Park had said in the consortium meeting. You gave me honest information when the easier thing was to protect yourself. That matters. He thought about what that quality looked like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who needed information and trusted that what they were getting was real. He thought about Sophie building her bookshelf with the 15-degree lean and calling it a design feature. She came off the stage after her presentation and found him in the crowd. You came, she said. I said I would, he said. She shrugged, like this was expected, but her eyes said something else entirely. They walked to the car together. How was the big meeting? She said. She knew there had been a big meeting. She knew it was important. She didn't know the details, and she hadn't asked for them. Good, Daniel said. Did you win? She said. He thought about that. I thought about the consortium's decision. The new contract. The oversight requirements that would protect the hospitals. Rebecca saying, add them. The room where everything had reversed without anyone raising their voice. Nobody lost, he said, which is the best outcome when hospitals are involved. Sophie thought about this for a moment. That's a very dad answer, she said. It's a very true answer, he said. She accepted this and got in the car. He drove home through the city with his daughter beside him, the day's significance settling around him quietly, and he thought about Thursday morning and what he was going to say to Rebecca Sterling. Not what he was going to demand, because he wasn't going to demand anything. Not what he was going to withhold, because there was nothing left to withhold. Just what was true. He had been undervalued. He had been blocked. He had been told he was nothing at a moment designed to make him feel it. And he had walked away, not because he knew what was coming, but because he knew what staying would cost, and the cost was more than the salary was worth. That was all. He was going to say that clearly, and he was going to mean it without anger, and then he was going to go to work. Because the hospitals needed the system to function. Because his team needed to run the simulation. Because Sophie needed lunch packed in the morning. Because he was still the same person he had always been, the person who answered at midnight, who drove to the substation, who wrote the 17-page report nobody wanted to read until it turned out to be exactly right. The job had changed. The person hadn't. And that in the end was the only leverage that had ever actually mattered. Thursday arrived, the way important days sometimes do, without fanfare, without ceremony, as an ordinary morning that happened to contain something extraordinary inside it. Daniel was at North Star's building at 6:40. He made coffee in the small kitchen on the second floor, the one nobody used this early because most of the engineering team didn't arrive until 8:30. He sat at his desk and went through his emails and reviewed the overnight simulation results that Priya's team had run on the new hospital network architecture. The numbers were good. Not perfect. There was a calibration issue in the backup sequencing that needed 2 more days of adjustment, but fundamentally sound. The kind of results that meant the work was going in the right direction. At 6:58, his assistant called from reception. Rebecca Sterling is here, she said. Send her up, Daniel said. He heard her before he saw her, the particular sound of heels on a hard floor, deliberate and evenly paced. She appeared in his office doorway at 7 exactly. No team, no communications director, no folder of strategic talking points. Just Rebecca Sterling in a gray jacket and the expression that was different from any expression he had seen on her face in 7 years. She looked for the first time in his experience of her genuinely uncertain. Daniel, she said. Come in, he said. Coffee. She blinked slightly at the normalcy of it. Yes, thank you. He poured it. She sat across from his desk, not the power chair. She always chose not the position that framed a conversation on her terms. Just the closest chair. Like someone who had decided positioning didn't matter this morning. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I'm not here to ask you to come back, she said. I want to say that first. I know, he said. I'm here because Claire was right, she said. Because it's right. And because I'm tired of being the person who does the strategic version of everything instead of the honest version. Daniel looked at her steadily. I read everything, she said. Not the summaries, the actual documents, all 26 months, every report, every memo, every recommendation that had your name in the metadata and someone else's name on the cover page. She paused. I signed the promotion denial memo. I want you to know that I understand what I signed and what it actually was. What was it? Daniel said. A man protecting himself using my signature, she said. And a CEO who trusted the presentation instead of looking at the foundation it was built on. The office was very quiet. Miles told me you lacked executive presence, she said. I believed him because he was articulate and I was new, and he seemed to understand the company's culture in a way I hadn't fully mapped yet. She stopped. What I didn't understand was that the culture he was describing was one he had built specifically to obscure what you were doing. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How long did it take you to see it? He asked. Completely. She thought about it. The consortium meeting. When you helped us with the remediation assessment. When you told the room our timeline was viable and didn't have to. She looked at him. That was the moment I understood the difference between you and every executive I've worked with who performs integrity and the thing itself. Daniel looked at his coffee. I said something to you that I cannot justify, Rebecca said. Not professionally, not personally. I told you that you were nothing without your job, in front of 14 people, deliberately, because I thought it would make you comply. She met his eyes directly. I was wrong about the strategy. I was wrong about you. And I was wrong in a way that I knew was wrong when I said it. Something in Daniel's chest settled, not because the words resolved what had happened. Words don't undo a moment, but because the absence of any excuse, any reframing, any corporate language, the pure, undecorated honesty of what she'd just said was the one thing he hadn't known he needed to hear until he heard it. I accept the apology, he said. Rebecca exhaled slowly through her nose the way someone exhales when they've been holding something for a long time. That's more than I deserve, she said. Maybe, Daniel said, but I'm not interested in keeping score. She looked at him. I quit because there was a line, he said. I don't know exactly when I found it, but it was somewhere in that room, and crossing back over it was never going to be the answer regardless of what you offered me afterward. He paused. That's not about you personally. That's about what I'm teaching Sophie by what I do. Rebecca blinked. You mentioned her, she said quietly. When you said I think I finally decided where I shouldn't work anymore. Your daughter. She asked me if I got fired, Daniel said. Something close to pain crossed Rebecca's face. What did you tell her? The truth, he said. That I decided where I shouldn't work anymore. Rebecca was quiet. She's 10, Daniel said. She's watching everything I do, what I tolerate, what I walk away from, what I go back to. He looked at Rebecca directly. I'm not willing to teach her that the price of stability is unlimited humiliation, not even at 9:30 in the morning when the mortgage is real. Rebecca set down her coffee mug. I thought needing stability meant you needed us, she said. It was almost exactly what she'd said to him in their third call 2 weeks ago. But this time it wasn't defensive, it was confessional. I did need stability, Daniel said. I just didn't need it from you specifically. I needed it from myself. They sat with that for a moment. Then Rebecca said, How is she, Sophie? Daniel allowed himself a small smile. She built a bookshelf. It leans about 15 degrees. She called it a design feature. Rebecca looked at him. And for just a moment, the CEO disappeared entirely, and there was just a woman sitting across from a man, and something that might have been the beginning of a genuine understanding passed between them. "She sounds like someone worth going home for," Rebecca said. "Yes," Daniel said. "She is." Rebecca stood. She extended her hand. Daniel shook it. "Good luck with the board," he said. "Good luck with the hospitals," she said. She left. Daniel sat alone in his office for a moment. The simulation results were still on his screen. The backup sequencing issue needed attention. Priya would be in at 8:30. He picked up his coffee and got back to work. What neither of them said in that meeting, what didn't need saying, was that the apology changed nothing, and everything simultaneously. It changed nothing about the past. It changed nothing about who worked where, or what the consortium had decided, or what Miles had done for 2 years while smiling across conference tables. It changed nothing practical. What it changed was the record. The honest record between two people of what had actually happened and why. And sometimes that's the only thing left that's worth getting right. The weeks that followed moved with the particular speed of work that matters. Daniel's team ran the full backup cascade simulation on the new hospital network architecture and found 2 additional calibration points that needed adjustment. They fixed them. They ran it again. The results came back clean. Priya brought the report to Daniel's desk at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, with the expression of someone who is trying not to look as satisfied as they feel. "It's good," she said. Daniel read the numbers carefully. "It's better than good," he said. "It's right," Priya said. "First time I've worked on something where right was actually the goal, and not just the language we use to describe close enough." Daniel looked at her. "Who did you work for before North Star?" She named a company. He knew it. He knew its culture, its leadership, its particular habit of treating safety margins as negotiable when quarterly numbers got tight. "I'm sorry," he said. She shrugged. "I'm here now." "Yes," he said. "You are." The certification process for the new hospital network contracts began in the 4th week of Daniel's time at North Star. It was the kind of process he had always done well. Methodical, thorough, built on the understanding that the people on the other end of the system were patients who had no idea whether the backup power in their ICU had been properly tested, and that their ignorance was not a reason to cut corners, but a reason to be more careful. He brought the consortium's technical team into the process directly. He invited Helen Park's facilities director to observe the simulation testing. He shared every step, every parameter, every result. Not because he was required to, because transparency was the point. Helen Park called him after the first certification milestone. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "In 20 years of managing hospital infrastructure, I have never had an energy contractor invite our team to observe their testing process," she said. "Not once. Every other contractor has treated it like proprietary information, like we should trust the certificate without seeing what it's based on." "You should see what it's based on," Daniel said. "It's your hospital." "Yes," she said. "It is." A pause. "I'm going to recommend North Star to every facility director I know." Daniel said, "I appreciate that, but recommend us because the work is right, not as a favor." Helen Park laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine surprise. "You know how rare it is for someone to say that?" "I'm learning it's rarer than it should be," Daniel said. He hung up and sat for a moment. Then he went to find Priya because the 3rd simulation had finished running and he wanted to see the numbers before end of day. At Apex Grid, the remediation was proceeding on the extended timeline Daniel had recommended. 6 additional days. Full backup cascade retesting. Independent technical certification at each stage. The oversight committee that the board had mandated met every Wednesday. Rebecca attended every meeting personally, which was something she had not done with any operational committee in her 11 months as CEO. She sat in those meetings and listened more than she spoke. She asked questions about the technical substrata, not the summaries, the actual work. She had developed the habit of reading original documents instead of briefings, which her assistant initially found alarming and eventually found simply to be how things worked now. The culture was shifting. slowly, imperfectly, with the particular friction of an organization that has operated one way for a long time, learning to operate differently. But shifting. Tom Reyes, the engineer who had texted Daniel on the day he resigned, noticed it first. He noticed it because his team had flagged a potential integration issue with one of the Sentinel remediation patches. And instead of the usual chain of escalation, that led eventually to a summary that landed on a director's desk 3 days later. Rebecca Sterling herself had walked into the engineering floor and asked to see the original finding. Tom showed her. She understood more of it than he'd expected. She asked 2 good questions, and 1 question that revealed she didn't fully understand the architecture, and she didn't pretend to understand it when Tom explained the gap. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "Keep the flag open until we have an answer." She left. Tom stood for a moment after she walked away. He texted Daniel, "Something's changing over here." Daniel texted back, "Good." Tom replied, "Did you do that?" Daniel replied, "No." She did. Which was both generous and true, which was the particular combination that made it worth saying. 6 weeks after the consortium meeting, Jonathan Vale called Daniel into his office. Not a formal meeting, just a conversation. Jonathan's door opened, 2 chairs angled toward each other. The particular informality of a leader who has decided that offices should be places where honest things are said, rather than performances staged. "Board reviewed the hospital network numbers," Jonathan said. "First phase certification is complete. Client satisfaction metrics are, I'll be honest with you, Daniel, they're the highest we've recorded." "The team is good," Daniel said. "The team is good because of how you run it," Jonathan said. "That's not me being generous. That's what Priya told the board liaison last week, unprompted." Daniel didn't say anything. "I want to talk about what comes next," Jonathan said. "The expansion contracts," Daniel said. "Those too," Jonathan said. "But I also want to talk about something bigger." He leaned forward. "I've been thinking about the protocol you established for handling the hospital facilities calls. The transparency process. The independent observation during testing. It's just the right way to do it," Daniel said. "It is," Jonathan said. "And I want to build it into everything North Star does. Not as a marketing strategy. As a standard. I want to publish it as our operational commitment, and then actually live up to it." He looked at Daniel. "I want you to design it." Daniel looked at him. "A company-wide technical integrity framework," Jonathan said. "Your name on it, your standards. How we certify, how we communicate, how we handle objections. What happens when an engineer flags a problem that an executive finds inconvenient?" He paused. "The answer to that last question needs to be in writing, and it needs to have teeth." Daniel thought about the 17-page report. The one nobody wanted to read until it turned out to be exactly right. "I thought about a room where 14 people sat silently, while a CEO decided that the timing of an investor call was more important than a safety warning." He thought about what it would mean to build a system where that couldn't happen, not because people were better, but because the system required honest accounting. "I'll need full authority over the standards," Daniel said. "No executive override without documented independent review." "Yes," Jonathan said. "And the framework applies upward too," Daniel said, "including your office." Jonathan looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning if I flag a safety issue, and you want to override it for business reasons, the framework applies to you too," Daniel said. "Not just the middle managers, the CEO." A pause. "Yes," Jonathan said. "That's the only way it works." Daniel nodded. "Then yes, I'll design it." They shook hands. Daniel went back to his office and sat down and thought for a long moment about the particular shape of a career that could end up here at a desk in a building that wasn't flashy, working for a man who put his phone in his pocket during breakfast and kept his word when his word was inconvenient. He thought about 7 years of 6 a.m. mornings. He thought about the badge on the table. He thought about 4 days. All it had ever required was 4 days. And everything that had happened. North Star, the consortium decision, the technical integrity framework, the culture beginning to shift at Apex Grid, the 14 hospital facilities whose backup systems were being certified properly for the first time, all of it traced back to a moment when a man decided there was a line he was not going to cross, and stepped back from it quietly and walked out a door without looking back. He opened a new document on his computer. He typed Technical Integrity Standards, North Star Energy Systems. Then he started writing. Sophie's bookshelf was finally finished, leveled, sanded, given a second coat of stain, and declared complete by its creator. She carried it into the living room and put it next to Daniel's reading chair and arranged 3 of his books on it with the particular care of someone presenting a gift they worked hard on and want to be seen properly. Daniel looked at it. The lean was still there. Maybe 12 degrees now instead of 15. She'd made a small structural adjustment that she explained to him in technical terms she'd invented herself. But the thing was solid. Real wood, real work, real joints that held. "It's good," he said. "It's better than good," she said, using his words back at him in the way she'd been doing since she was 4, which still made him feel something he couldn't fully name. "It's right." He looked at his daughter. He thought about what Rebecca had said. She sounds like someone worth going home for. He had never needed a CEO to tell him that. But hearing it said out loud in that particular moment of that particular morning had clarified something he already knew in a way that made it feel new. "Yes," he said. "It is." Sophie was satisfied with this. She went to get cereal. Daniel sat in his reading chair next to the 12-degree bookshelf and thought about the message Rebecca had sent him 3 days earlier. Not a call this time. Just a text, direct and unstrategized, the kind of message that a person sends when they've stopped performing and started simply communicating. It said, "I thought the company made you valuable. I was wrong." 11 words. No explanation. No context. No ask. Daniel had read it twice. Then he'd set his phone on the counter and gone to check on Sophie's homework. He hadn't replied. Not because he was punishing her, because there was nothing to add. The message said the thing that needed saying, and anything he wrote back would be less than the silence. I understood that she was changing. Imperfectly. Slowly. With the particular difficulty of someone who built her identity on a certain understanding of power, and is now dismantling that understanding brick by brick while still running a company. It was hard work. He didn't envy it. He also didn't need to supervise it. That was her work. His was here. In the weeks after the Technical Integrity Framework was drafted, reviewed, and formally adopted by North Star's board, the industry noticed. Not immediately. Not loudly. The way real things are noticed gradually by people whose opinions are formed by watching what happens over time rather than what is announced at press conferences. The first industry publication to write about it described North Star's new standards as unusually specific and surprisingly binding. The reviewer noted that the framework included language that explicitly prevented executive override of documented safety warnings without independent technical review, and that this language applied at every level, including CEO. The reviewer called it either a genuine commitment or the most sophisticated PR strategy in the energy infrastructure sector, and said time would tell which it was. Jonathan Vail read the piece and said nothing about it to Daniel. Daniel read the piece and said nothing about it to Jonathan. The framework was already being applied. That was the only answer either of them needed. 3 former Apex Grid clients reached out to North Star in the month following the framework's adoption. None of them cited the framework specifically. They cited Daniel. They said they wanted to work with people who answered when something went wrong, who told the truth before it became a crisis, who treated their facilities like the critical infrastructure they were, rather than line items on a contract. Daniel handled each call himself. He told each client the same thing. He had told everyone since the first day at North Star, "We'll do the work right. We'll tell you when we see a problem, and we'll give you honest answers, even when honest answers are inconvenient. If that matches what you need, we'd like to work with you." All 3 signed. Not because of the title on his business card. Because of 7 years of being the kind of person who answers the phone at 2 a.m. and drives to the substation and writes the 17-page report nobody wants to read. Because trust, unlike credit, cannot be borrowed from someone else's reputation. You build it yourself, one honest interaction at a time, and it follows you wherever you go. At North Star's 6-month review, Jonathan presented the Critical Infrastructure Division's numbers to the board. New contracts, client retention, safety certification rates, industry satisfaction metrics. They were strong across every category, strong enough that 2 board members asked Jonathan what had changed in the division. Jonathan said, "We hired the right person and then actually listened to him." The board chair said, "That sounds simple." Jonathan said, "It is. That's the part that's embarrassing." Daniel wasn't at that board meeting. How was at Sophie's school watching her present a new science project, this one, about structural load distribution, which she had developed. She explained to Daniel beforehand, because of the bookshelf, and what she'd learned about weight and angles and why things lean. Her presentation was 12 minutes long. Her model worked. She explained why it worked in language that was technically accurate and completely accessible, which is the hardest combination to achieve, and the one that matters most when the people listening need to understand something important. Her teacher pulled Daniel aside afterward and said, "She explained it better than most adults would." "She learned it from building something real," Daniel said. "What did she build?" the teacher asked. "A bookshelf," Daniel said. The teacher looked mildly confused. Daniel didn't explain further. On the drive home, Sophie asked, "Are you happy?" Daniel glanced at her. "At your new job?" she said. "Are you actually happy? Not just okay, actually happy." He thought about Priya saying, "First time I've worked on something where right was actually the goal." He thought about Jonathan leaving his phone in his pocket. He thought about the simulation numbers coming back clean. He thought about Helen Park laughing and saying, "You know how rare it is for someone to say that." He thought about walking out of a glass-walled building on a rainy Thursday morning with an old laptop bag and no plan, and a 10-year-old daughter who would be home from school at 4. "Yes," he said, "actually happy." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything important. "Good," she said, "and then, because you were kind of not happy before, you just didn't say it." Daniel looked at the road. "I know," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I know you did," he said. She turned to look out the window. "I'm glad you quit," she said. It wasn't a complicated statement. It wasn't strategic or calculated. It was a 10-year-old telling her father something she'd been waiting to say since the first evening he came home at 5:30, looking like the weight of something had lifted. Daniel drove in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Me too, kid." The city moved around them, ordinary and indifferent, in the way cities are full of other people in other cars, making other decisions about what to tolerate and what to walk away from, about where the line is, and what it costs to cross it, and what it costs not to. Daniel Mercer had found his line on a stormy Thursday morning in a glass-walled room where 14 people sat in silence, and a badge lay on a conference table. He had found it not by searching for it, but by arriving at the moment when crossing it was simply no longer possible. And everything that followed North Star, the hospitals, the framework, the contracts, the 6 a.m. mornings in a building that didn't look impressive. Everything traced back to that single quiet, irreversible decision. Not to argue, not to negotiate, not to calculate the mortgage against the humiliation, and decide the math still worked. Just to stand up, close the laptop, set down the badge, and walk out the door. Because a paycheck can provide security, and a title can provide status, and a company can provide opportunity, but none of those things can manufacture the judgment, the character, the trust, and the 7 years of showing up honestly that a person carries through the door every single morning. Rebecca Sterling had told Daniel Mercer he was nothing without his job. What she hadn't understood, what she spent the following months learning one honest meeting at a time, was that the job had never been the source. He was. He always had been. And the people who actually knew what that was worth had been waiting on the other side of the door the